In this video, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some interesting policy developments that happened in the 1980s. A lot of what happened in the 1980s is just the same song, a different verse. The problem from the 1940s and 50s and 60s, the problem of subsidizing agriculture, creating grain surpluses, is still continuing, and the big problems of federal spending are also continuing. The new things that are beginning to happen in the 1980s deal with international trade in world markets, which we already saw some in the 1970s when we learned about the Russian wheat deal and President Carter's grain embargo. So a couple of things I want you to keep in mind as you're reading through the textbook and learning about these things is never forget that farmers are clever. I think there's this assumption that the average person walking around has that farmers are somehow not astute business persons. So here's an example of what I mean. You've heard of the PIC, the Payment in Kind program. This is a program where in order to get rid of surplus commodities, you're going to give the farmer grain instead of giving the farmer money when they've earned a subsidy from the government. Actually, physically giving them grain is, okay, that's hard to do because you've got to store and transport and move it around. So what you would do instead is you'd give them a certificate. It's a piece of paper that says, here you go, get yourself some grain. And these certificates were tradable. A market developed for those certificates. So you could go out and you could buy a certificate from somebody else. And so farmers figured out a clever way to leverage that. They would go out and get themselves the non-recourse marketing loan, the Commodity Credit Corporation loan, and they would borrow, say, $2 per bushel of corn. And now what the farmer is supposed to do is they're supposed to go out and try to sell their corn at the market price. And if they can't sell it at the market price, the Commodity Credit Corporation repossesses the grain and there's no recourse. In effect, the CCC is buying the corn for $2 a bushel. So what farmers would do is they would go out on the open marketplace and they would buy a PIC certificate for $1.50. And then they would take the PIC certificate and say, hey, this PIC certificate, this cert was the word they used, they shortened it. This cert is worth however many bushels of corn you said I owed you. Here's the piece of paper. And they would say, great, fine, done. So now the farmer borrowed money for $2 and then went and bought the piece of paper for $1.50 and used the piece of paper to pay off the $2 loan. So the farmer skimmed 50 cents. They called that the pick and roll. The net effect is the exact same thing as a target price with a deficiency payment. Now let's talk about loans versus deficiency payments. What's beginning to happen in the 1980s and specifically in the 1985 Farm Bill, and you see hints of this in previous farm bills. I want you to imagine a slow process of change as opposed to dramatic fast changes. Most policy changes are incremental and kind of boring, and you look up one day and say, wow, things have changed over the last 20 years. How did that happen? So our non-recourse marketing loans are slowly morphing into target prices with deficiency payments. So what ends up happening in the 85 Farm Bill is the 85 Farm Bill would set minimum target prices. And then you would go out and you would have the option of taking the Commodity Credit Corporation CCC, the non-recourse marketing loan, or take a deficiency payment, and they called that deficiency payment an LDP, a loan deficiency payment. So they weren't calling it a target price with a deficiency payment, but it was a target price with a deficiency payment. And the farmer has this option of doing either one. So the farmer has the option of letting the government repossess the grain and in effect selling the grain to the government at the loan rate, or going out and selling the grain on the open market and then taking a loan deficiency payment. And it went on like that for quite a while with the two policies simultaneously working side by side. And it's important to stop and take a look at the rules, because the rules and regulations surrounding these policies are gradually beginning to morph. Loan rates are now tied to, or in the 80s began to be tied to, prices over the last 5 marketing years. And what they would do is they would look at the crop price over the last 5 marketing years, not crop years, marketing years. This is after the crop is harvested and then sits in storage until it's consumed. And then the next year the harvest pops up, and that's the marketing year. And they would use an Olympic average. An Olympic average is just like they do at the Olympics. You got a bunch of judges judging a gymnast, and they all give a score, and they toss out the high and they toss out the low. So they take the last 5 years, toss out the high, toss out the low, and that's how they determined the loan rate. So the loan rate basically becomes a type of average of previous prices, and that's important to consider because that's not what we used to do with the policy. Before, the policy would say 1910 to 1914, we're going to do parity. We're going to say the price has to be 80% of what it was in 1910 to 1914. So we've adjusted the rules now for deciding what the loan rate is, what the subsidy is. It's based on some historic price. And the other thing to remember is that oftentimes that price is going to be like a local price in the county. So the cotton loan rate minus the posted county price is the loan deficiency payment for cotton. And again, that farmer can go with a non-recourse marketing loan or take the loan deficiency payment. During a large chunk of our policy story, dairy has also been subsidized, and the reason why is because dairy products can be stored. You can turn milk into cheese, and you can then store the cheese. You can turn milk into non-fat dry milk and then store that pretty much indefinitely. And so what the USDA would do is it would support prices by buying up the storable commodities. And the way the prices worked is they took milk and they put it into 2 classifications, Class 1 and Class 2. Class 1 milk is milk that's used for drinking. It's Class 1 fluid milk. Class 2 milk is milk that's used for all the other things you can make out of milk, all these various dairy products. And what's interesting is it's not like they grade the milk and say this milk needs to be drunk because it's better and this milk over here needs to be turned into cheese because it's inferior. It was more of this one got turned into cheese, therefore it's Class 2 milk, and therefore the farmer gets a lower price for it, which I always thought was kind of a weird way of doing it. Now, the dairy policy back in the 80s cut the United States into 44 production regions. And in each of those 44 regions, the federal government set the price for Class 1 milk in each region. And the price difference between regions was supposed to be based on what it took to store and ship milk from wherever you happen to be up to Wisconsin, which is kind of considered the dairy center of the state. Now, some interesting things happened with our dairy policy in the 1980s, and what you've got to remember is that when it comes to policy, there's no such thing as a magic wand. If our goal is to raise the income of the dairy farmer, there's going to be some side effect of that, and the side effect of the policies we were using was producing more dairy than we needed. So we're propping the price up in order to get money to the farmer, and as the result, the farmer, they're clever. They know what they're doing. They see the price go up, and so they're going to produce more. That's just the law of supply. And so we're in this situation now where we're storing up all this dairy products, and we're giving it away. I remember back in the 80s, one of my grandparents was on Social Security. When he went to get his Social Security check, he'd get a big block of government cheese. So in the 80s, the USDA attempted to create this buyout program. It was part of the Farm Bill. So what would happen is if you were a dairy farmer and you decided you wanted to get out of the dairy farming business, you would promise not to milk a cow for 5 more years and sell off all your cows out in the open market. So the cows would basically end up being hamburger. And what the farmers would do is they would submit a bid to the USDA, and if the USDA accepted the bid, the farmer would terminate production, sell off their entire herd. They call it the whole herd buyout program. And I want to talk about the method they used to do this. They used a thing called a reverse auction. So what the farmer does is they put a bid in an envelope. They write down on a piece of paper, if I had this much money, I would just give up on dairy farming. I would sell my cows. I would do something different with my life. And the game that they're playing when they put that piece of paper or put that number on that piece of paper is they want to make sure they put a big enough number to justify getting out of dairy production. But if they put too big of a number in, someone else is going to get their bid accepted and not them. And so the logic is this should elicit the farmer's minimum willingness to accept. And here's what I find interesting about this. I'm recording this right now in October of 2020. We just announced the Nobel Prize winners in economics, and the Nobel Prize winners won the Nobel Prize for their work on auction theory. So like experts on things like reverse auctions just got the Nobel Prize in economics. It's kind of neat that I'm talking about this, and that just happened. So it was a reverse auction. The farmer puts a bid in, and the USDA would just take a look at all the bids, and what they would do is they'd start at the cheapest one, and they'd say, here's the lowest bid, we're buying this farmer out. And they just kept buying farmers out till they ran out of money. So the farmer has to think strategically when they place their bid. They put it up too high, they might not get bought out. They put it down too low, they left money on the table. And so the logic is they should sit down and think very clearly about what their willingness to accept is and just take what they'd be willing to accept. So that's a thing that happened back in the 80s. What we have to remember is that farmers are clever. And we have to stop and ask the question, what type of farmer would voluntarily submit a bid to the government and say, hey, if you'll give me this much money, I'm out? Well, not a profitable farmer. A farmer that's making a lot of money is going to keep going at it. Or if they were to get bought out, it would require a really high price. So they're very unlikely to have a bid accepted if they submit one. It's the unprofitable farmers that would do this. It's the ones that are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy that would do this. It's the ones that are ready to retire. So maybe you're a 70-year-old dairy farmer and your kids don't want to continue dairy farming. And so in my opinion, all it really did was take those individuals that were teetering on the edge of a business failure and kind of bail them out from their business failure and allow them to get out of it without getting, without having to file for bankruptcy. Or the ones who were sitting there going, I'm ready to retire. I've had enough of this. It's time for me to go. Oh, the government will give me a check if I leave. Sure, I'll take a check. Why not? So I don't personally believe that buyout programs like this are terribly effective, but we did anyways. Let's talk a little bit about the concept of base acres and historical yields. Now, the old way of determining the payment a farmer would get, what we started doing in the 40s and 50s and 60s and into the 70s, and what we started, and how we started morphing from that. The old way of doing it is you agree to set land aside, and you will then get the program price based on parity for your allotted production, your allotment. Any extra production is sold on the open market at whatever the going rate is. The old way is allotments and acreage reductions and a program price. The new way is you have a history of crop production and a historic yield. Historic number of acres, historic yield, multiply those together, you get a historic production amount. And instead of saying, here's your allotment, the new policies say, here is some percentage of your historic production, and you can get the program price or the target price for that percent of your historic production. Now, farmers, of course, are clever. Farmers are clever. Most of the time, the base is based on some type of rolling average. It's based on your base over the last few years. It's based on what you produced, what your yield was, and how many acres you planted over some past time period. Again, typically 5 years. Drop the high and the low, an Olympic average. Well, if you plant more acres, then over time your base slowly gets larger. And if you increase your yield, then over time your base slowly gets larger. And if you're getting paid a subsidy from the government that's based on a percentage of your past production and past yield, well, then you've got an incentive to try to crank up your yield and crank up your production, farm bigger. And there were some provisions in the 85 Farm Bill to kind of cut this out. This was called base building. So farmers were actually looking at this and responding to the policy. That's something that's very important to remember, is that people respond to incentives. And when you incentivize base building, you get farmers trying to build up their base. We see a new conservation reserve program pop up in the 85 Farm Bill. This time, the farmers had to sign a 10 or 15-year contract for their conservation reserve. So if you want to put land in conservation, you've got to sign a long-term contract. Why? Why would we do this? Remember what happened in the 70s after the Russian wheat deal, when prices spiked and farmers started planting more. Well, a lot of that land they planted was land that was in a short-term conservation reserve. They pulled that land out of the reserve, and that's the land that came into production that caused us to overproduce and caused the price crashes that eventually led to the 1980s farm crisis. But now we put it in a long-term reserve, meaning it's very difficult for the farmer to pull it out to respond to price changes. And this has popped up in recent history, during the early 2000s, during the mid-2000s, when prices were very high and there were farmers who were locked into 10-year reserves. They were begging to pull it out, and it was all like, oh no, you're in a 10-year reserve. You got to keep it there. Just like with the dairy program, sealed bid, reverse auction. So again, how does this work? You sit down and you figure out how much you'd be willing to accept in exchange for not farming your land. You write that on a piece of paper, you put that in an envelope, you hand it to the USDA. They open the envelopes up and they take the lowest bid first, and they say that's the first farmer that we're going to pull out of production, and on and on and on and go. And just as predictably with the dairy buyout program, what types of farmers are going to do this? Well, it's farmers who don't want to farm anymore. It's farmers who have been farming their whole life and they want to retire, and it's going to be on land that's not terribly productive. So there's always going to be some slippage with this, because it's going to always be people that were farming land that wasn't very good, ergo not profitable, or they just weren't efficient farmers, so they're better off not farming the land from a financial standpoint, or farmers who are close to retiring. Well, I think that is the end of what we wanted to talk about in the 1980s. I'll catch you on the next video.